Yeah, one of the topics I got interested in, spirituality in general, and how it coexists with modern thinking, with logical thinking. These Cree hunters, for example, know about animals certainly better than, as well as any biologist, and that they spend hours looking at them. So they have that empirical knowledge, and for me, as as somebody coming from a totally different tradition, I'm struggling over how they can also have these deep spiritual beliefs about things in the environment, that real things, not just fantasies or dreams, although dreaming, of course, is extremely important. One of those, while I was living with the Cree, and you would miss it if you didn't pay attention. They would be almost matter-of-factly, a piece of bone would be held on a piece of stick in front of the fire, and then a young child would usually be told to take it around to show it to everybody in the camp once it had been burned. This was scapulomancy, this thing. And while most of and I saw, 20, 30 different occasions. It wasn't just done, and it certainly wasn't done for me. And, they would, some of this stuff had power in the sense that children were hidden under the blankets. They couldn't, there were certain precautions. But compared to what we think of as rituals or ceremonies or that, these are very subtle and often missed. But on the other hand, they're very modern. While a lot of them related to where we would expect to find game. The essential job was to tell us where to go and look for game. But they used it also. We'd made an arrangement with the Hudson Bay manager, who came twice a year by aircraft. We were waiting at the lake, or frozen lake, where he was going to land. At the date we'd assigned. We kept track of time all through the winter and knew what date it was. And every morning and night while we waited, scapulomancies, numbers and numbers were done to predict the arrival of the aircraft. So, they're very modern in their believing it. And then people would tell their dreams, and all of these things would be put together to try and figure out what was about to happen. Now, what I noticed was the interpretation was never very definitive. They might say, oh, well, we're unfortunate, we don't have any wise old people who know how to read the bones. But I found this so often that it was the sort of, in other words, the meaning of the oracle only became clear after the fact. And then they would explain, see, that was the moose you killed there, and that. They would, some of them never got explained. Some of them were duds. They couldn't figure out what the oracle was saying. And where, the two prominent papers on the issue of scapulomancy among the Cree and Innu at the time was, number one, randomizing, that the theory was that while the bone would not show where the animals were, this was the Western scientific approach, they'd say it send you off in random directions. Whereas the problem they saw was a hunter will tend to return again and again to where he's been successful in the past. And this breaks that habit, because the animals obviously don't return, certain animals do return again and again to where they, but not all animals do. And anyway, animals they were after. So that was one theory. The other theory was that this is a difficult decision. A group has to decide, do we pick up camp and go there? We have to decide collectively. And so rather than, that theory was, rather than putting the onus on a leader to have to make the decision, and then maybe it was discovered there's no animals there at all, and he looks like a fool. But this was, so they'd make the group, it would externalize the decision. The decision would be made by somebody other than the group, and the group would follow it. And if they were wrong, too bad. But that was the two theories. My third theory was it was an exploration of the pre-existing spiritual beliefs, that by being able to explain a hunt afterwards in terms of what the spirits had foretold, you're giving empirical demonstration of your beliefs, shall we say, and that sort of thing. So, I certainly didn't, I guess I've never been able, there is a movement in some anthropologists who suggest that in writing about an indigenous group's beliefs, you write accepting those beliefs as factual, and write the book as a native person would who actually believes these things. As a Marxist, I guess I come from the position that religion is a fantasy created for certain purposes to maintain the social order in a certain way, and so I quite happily went into writing Bringing Home Animals without any pretense that I was presenting the spirits as factual, presenting the outcome of divination as factual, as presenting any of this. Now, I've been criticized for that since. There is certainly a convention, even among earlier anthropologists from Malinowski on, to what Malinowski says is to see things from the native's point of view. And that, I agree, I've got to understand that. But then if I'm doing my own attempt to analyze those things, once I've got some level of understanding of what the native point of view is, that to me is not the end of anthropology. Then, again, I'm a comparative. How do we link this together with what other people do in other cultures and come to some intelligence about what might be behind all of this? Now, that's incredibly speculative, and we wasted, if you like, a lot of time in anthropology pursuing mathematical models and abstractions to try to link together diverse cultures that have cross-cousin marriage or have this or that and why they all do it. And I was in graduate school when I was immersed in all of that literature and it's amazing how little of it has been used today. So, but we had to go, I think, through all of those exercises in this pursuit of a comparative understanding of humanity from the individual cases. And obviously, belief in spiritual things is still very much alive, even with industrial society, even with Christianity, even, so that one still among the Cree, there's revival of spiritual movements along particularly the James Bay coast since I was there, there's a lot more happening in terms of people are linking up with the Pan-Indian movement and going to sun dances, you know, where they torture themselves. This is so it's not the case that the introduction to industrial society suddenly removes all of these. People suddenly become like us in that sense. Some of them do, some, you know, but it's their own decisions, and you know, I'm keeping an eye on the interesting developments in spirituality that are still occurring today in traditional societies, but that, so that scapulomancy, and there have been various other aspects. You know, I was talking about fur trade history, where I try to, you know, unpack what is really going on. I recently was asked to get involved in a project in Northern Ontario where there is the Indigenous groups there would like to be able to challenge the 1850 Robinson Superior Treaty. Treaties were signed before Confederation. What was Ontario, what has become Ontario now. Most of southern Ontario had been purchased in small individual purchases from Indian bands. But what happened in Northern Ontario, a mining company started operating in areas that had never been purchased. And the Indians, who were very sophisticated, they had many of them were on both sides of the border. They knew about American treaties and this sort of thing. They had sided with the British in the War of 1812 against the Americans and were rewarded with annual presents from the British. So there was, so as soon as this mining started, they objected and tried to first marched on the government, you know, went all the way to southern Ontario to meet with the colonial and complain, and were immediately thrown in jail. But after a while they were released and went back. And then following that, they actually attacked or landed at the mining camp with guns, and the miners all left. There was no bloodshed or anything. So this scared the government, and so they sent a team of treaty negotiators to find out. However, they got things so, particularly in Lake Superior, they used the Hudson Bay Company, who were more or less their agents and that, and they told, Hudson Bay Company said, well, our customers in each of our posts, that's a band, and that's the legitimate group that should negotiate land claims. Whereas my analysis of the situation is people only came to the post very infrequently. They didn't come together as a group. They weren't a social group. They had their groups out on the land, and they were multifamily groups of landowners. And that land tenure system was never acknowledged in the treaty. And so that if they're going to successfully challenge the treaty, they need to you know, so some of the research I'm doing is helping them put forward a case of what should have been the acknowledged land tenure system of the people who could legitimately give up land, you know, surrender land by a treaty. It was another land surrender treaty. And the groups that I'm working for never even showed up. They didn't sign, they didn't show up at the treaty signing. You know, there's many reasons why the treaty was wrong, but land tenure system there happens, you know, so so that historical stuff where people have relied on the fur trade overmuch, and what the opinions were of the fur traders, some of whom were quite, I don't condemn, but they came from a Western market-oriented perspective. Their understanding of Native people was always seen through that lens, and who was good hunters and who, that sort of thing. So I'm very interested in fur trade history, and I would say people like Toby Morantz and other modern fur trade have adopted, I'm very much in agreement with their newer approach that plays much more credit to the part that Indigenous people played in the trade, in shaping the trade, in insisting on the debt system, which many people think of as a form of slavery that Native people were held by. Not at all. It was their choice, because I have a whole argument as to why the debt system. My argument, it comes back to this way of understanding self-provisioning. If you understand that people are going into the bush mainly for meat, fish, wood for their fires and that, and to enable them to do that, yes, they trade fur, but their motivation is not capitalist. It's not towards a fur. That understanding of the fur trade history, and of course it's all history now. It's now, but in that paper I wrote on the end of fur trade history, I noted it is a kind of peculiar history in that all of the archives are held by either a private company or some private foundation has been founded to look after the interests of the fur trade. So it's a very fur trader oriented, which is, I have great admiration for the fur traders and their what they did in opening up the country and that, but it's only a partial view. And to try and put together, as Native people didn't leave behind many records at the time, we have to be a little more speculative, I guess, on how we reinterpret encounters between traders and Native people in those early days. But yeah, it was something that I was interested in. My thesis also took a major fight with people who, I guess, partly following a Marxist perspective, the belief that, Marx himself basically, Marx and Engels adopted the sort of social evolution position that hunters and gatherers have certain characteristics, forms of land tenure, forms of that, and that once agriculture is invented, then you get a different kind of society and that, and so on, till you come to, and these. Whereas I immediately saw that the hunters that I knew were not stuck in some pre-agricultural age. They traded with agriculturalists. They continued to develop their hunting and gathering activities, and techniques and knowledge and all of that sort of thing. So whereas Eleanor Leacock, at the time that I was writing about hunting territories and that, she'd almost been accepted as the word that the hunting territories were a result of the entrance into their lives of traders, and this idea that trading introduced capitalist notions. And from that, it got to the notion of owning animals, and after that, it got to owning land. That this was the progression. It wasn't part of hunting and gathering per se; it was part of trading. And I was able to. I think that the tide has turned on that argument. I think Leacock was wrong. Rolf Knight, who was one of my professors at Toronto, had a more, I thought, more persuasive argument. He said that hunting territories could not have existed in the long term because of two reasons. One, demographic variability, that a group of families who might own a hunting territory this time, over the ages, they would either rise and, they'd have many, many sons who needed land and that, and there would never be enough land, or they'd have all daughters. The variations in demography would be such that no single fixed system. The problem there was he believed Speck when Speck said these are bounded areas that are passed on religiously from father to son. They're much more flexible than that. And I was shown that in my own research, and it can be shown in historical research. In the paper I was telling you where I compared Speck's map with my map, I was, first of all, see some very big changes, but interviewing the people involved, I could figure out why they changed. And it was an environment, there was a forest fire or something that people moved their territory. So it's not a fixed, and the other thing he said was ecological, the argument that a fixed hunting territory would never be productive always. It would sometimes, and so they'd have to move at times of forest fires or whatever. Again, that's true, but it helped me come up with a much more flexible idea on what these hunting territories are like indigenously, and anyway, that was what I argued in that side of my argument. Yeah, I guess going chronologically, I passed over that part and was looking for research in other parts of the world. And to say I did that one, but I found that every time I was back in Canada, I was far too occupied with Indigenous research questions, either support work, with political support work, testifying in court cases. I also, when there were projects underway which would have impacts on Aboriginal people, I in several cases bid on contracts to do environmental impact assessment. Not because I wanted the money, but I felt that a lot of this work is being done by people who are basically not qualified. They're biologists or they may spend time up north, but dealing with Indigenous people on what the impacts of a mine or a forestry project or something. So I was very fortunate. I haven't had many. Memorial is not a big graduate school. So, and not everybody who comes wants to work on, so I was lucky to have a few good graduate students. Trina Orchard was one of my good, Peter Armitage was my best graduate student, did his research in Mangan, and continued to work on applied work after, well, he started his PhD at Laval and never finished. It was really too bad, but he found he could make a living doing private, and he's a very, there's a few private contractors who do really excellent work. Peter Usher is one of those people, and Peter Armitage, my friend, and so he and I worked on one of those projects where a new highway was planned across the center of Labrador from Lap City, Wabash to Goose Bay, and we knew it would have impacts on the Innu. And the Innu had not got a signed land claim. In fact, they'd basically, the leadership went through a long period where they decided they would not ever go for a land claim or even official status as Indians. They had an ideology, that the Europeans that were here were illegitimately here and had to leave, kind of thing. It was just it went on for some years, but it was not a particularly realistic movement, and so they got back into land claims much later. But as I say, doing that research on the land claim was important for me in getting to understand the history of the Innu in Labrador. So while I still kept an eye on things in the Crees area of James Bay, and I did a summer research project on the language of instruction. At that time, there was a lot of dispute between parents, and you couldn't figure out who was on what side as to whether they should teach Cree in the schools or whether they should teach only English and they would manage the Cree at home. And that's still really an unresolved issue all these years later. But I interviewed parents on that and that. So I was keeping up with the James Bay Cree stuff, but also getting more and more involved with both the Micmac and the Innu in Labrador. I've visited Inuit Labrador communities, but I haven't done much research there. With the Micmac, the whole of the Micmac on the island had gotten themselves organized, but they had no official recognition. And so we were hoping for a land claim for them, and I did some research on that. And at one point, the Department of Indian Affairs or the Department of Justice wanted to know whether they had bands, because one of the definitions of an Indian is a member of a band. And so that was a very interesting project on the use of the term band in Canadian anthropology, in popular usage, and my basic thing is a band means nothing. It's the least organized form of social organization, and so almost anything qualifies as a band at least. So, but nevertheless, it wasn't persuasive because they disallowed the land claim, and it's never really been resolved. And now I also advised them against going for they were offered this much more recently, offered the option of landless band status, meaning they would have Indian status, but because they didn't have a reserve, any of the benefits that go to people on account of living on reserves, such as housing and that sort of thing, they were not eligible for. But they could get some of the things like education. And they've gone for that, but they're a huge mess trying to figure out. So I'm really out of that situation. I still work with the Innu and Labrador. They've asked me to, I guess we're, okay, yeah. So I have another current project with the Innu and Labrador on writing a history, which is very interesting. Okay.